crowd gasped when Ezra Stone, mute for 15 years, became the sole bidder for a blind woman deemed worthless except for her violin. Her haunting melody shattered his fortress of silence that very night, unearthing emotions he thought had died alongside his voice. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. Under the merciless sun of the Montana Territory, Ezra Stone rode with a measured pace, the brim of his weathered hat casting a thin shadow across his face. His dappled gray stallion moved with quiet determination, hooves disturbing the loose dirt of the trail that wound through the valley. The silence that surrounded them was as much a part of Ezra as the clothes on his back, a companion he'd known intimately since the day a Sioux arrow tore through his throat 15 years ago. The wound had healed, but his voice never returned, leaving him in a world where silence was his only language. The town of Redemption Creek appeared on the horizon, a collection of wooden structures huddled against the vast emptiness of the plains. Ezra rarely ventured into town, preferring the solitude of his ranch 20 miles outside its borders, but necessity had driven him here today. His ranch hand, an old Mexican named Miguel, had broken his leg, leaving Ezra short-handed with winter approaching. He needed help, even if it meant enduring the stares and whispers that always followed him. As he rode down the main street, the usual activity slowed. Eyes tracked him, some curious, others wary. Ezra had grown accustomed to the attention. A man who couldn't speak was an oddity in these parts, and the scar that stretched across his throat like a second smile told a story he couldn't. Sheriff Dawson stood outside the jailhouse, thumbs hooked in his belt. He nodded as Ezra approached. "Stone," he said in greeting. Ezra touched the brim of his hat in response. The sheriff was one of the few people who didn't treat him like a curiosity. "You're just in time. Auction's about to start at the old meeting hall." Ezra raised an eyebrow in question. Train brought in some workers from back east, indentured servants mostly. People looking for a new start out west, willing to work off their passage. The sheriff's voice lowered. "Heard there's a few special cases in this batch." Ezra nodded his thanks for the information and guided his horse toward the meeting hall at the far end of town. The building, once a church before the new one was built, now served as Redemption Creek's gathering place. A small crowd had already assembled outside. He dismounted, tying his horse to a post, and made his way inside. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and the murmur of conversation. Men and women from town and surrounding homesteads filled the wooden benches, their attention focused on a small stage where Mayor Hollister stood with a ledger in hand. "Folks, as you know, we've got ourselves some fresh labor from the Eastern Settlement Company," the mayor announced. "Each of these people has signed a contract for 2 years' service in exchange for their passage west. They'll work hard, follow the laws of our town, and when their time's up, they'll be free to stay on or move along as they please." Ezra found a spot near the back, leaning against the wall as the first person was led onto the stage. Early Irishman with calloused hands, who went quickly to a farmer looking for extra help with his fields. Next came a young woman with 3 small children, all of them wide-eyed with fear, who were taken in by the childless wife of the general store owner. The procession continued, each person's skills and background announced before bids were accepted. Ezra observed without interest. He needed someone strong enough for ranch work, someone who wouldn't mind the isolation or be put off by his inability to speak. "And now," the mayor said, lowering his voice dramatically, "we have a special case." A woman was led onto the stage, and the room fell silent. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, long chestnut hair that caught the light from the window. She wore a simple gray dress, its fabric worn but clean. But it was the cloth tied around her eyes that drew everyone's attention, a blindfold that concealed the upper portion of her face. "This here is Miss Charlotte Harlow," Mayor Hollister announced, 26 years of age, from Boston. "Lost her sight to fever 3 years ago." He cleared his throat. "She comes with special provisions in her contract. She's to be treated with dignity, given proper accommodation, and allowed to keep her violin, which I'm told she plays quite skillfully." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A blind woman would be of little use on a frontier homestead. She couldn't cook safe, couldn't tend children without seeing them, couldn't spot danger or work the land. "Starting bid is $15 for a 2-year contract," the mayor continued, his voice betraying doubt that anyone would take her. The room remained silent. Charlotte stood still as stone, her chin lifted slightly, hands clasped before her. Though she couldn't see the crowd, she must have felt their stares, their silent judgment. Something stirred in Ezra's chest, a recognition perhaps. He knew what it was to be seen as broken, to have people look at you and see only what you lacked. Before he could reconsider, he raised his hand. The mayor's eyes widened. "I see, Mur. Stone has bid $15. Do I hear 20? No one spoke. No one raised a hand. Very well then. $15 to Ezra Stone for a 2-year contract with Miss Harlow." Ezra moved forward, pulling coins from his pocket and placing them on the table before the mayor. He signed his name in the ledger, his script rough but legible. "M.R. Stone," the mayor said quietly. "I feel I should mention that Miss Harlow requires ... special considerations." "Are you certain?" Ezra cut him off with a sharp look, then turned toward Charlotte. She stood where she had been left, uncertainty evident in the slight tremor of her lips. He approached her slowly, aware that she couldn't see him coming. When he was close enough, he gently touched her elbow. She startled. "Who's there?" Her voice was soft, cultured, with an accent that marked her as educated. "Eastern. Miss Harlow," the mayor called. "You've been contracted to Mr. Ezra Stone. He'll be taking you to his ranch outside of town." He paused. "I should mention that Mr. Stone doesn't speak, hasn't for many years." A flicker of something fear, confusion, resignation passed across what was visible of her face. "I see," she said, then gave a small, humorless laugh. "Or rather, I don't, but I understand." Beside her on the stage lay a small trunk and a violin case, worn at the edges but carefully tended. Ezra gathered both, tucking the case securely under his arm. He then offered his elbow to Charlotte, waiting until her fingers found the rough fabric of his coat. "You'll have to guide me, Mr. Stone," she said, "and I hope you'll find some way to communicate, as it seems neither of us has the luxury of normal conversation." As Ezra led her from the meeting hall, he could feel the eyes of the townspeople on them, the mute rancher and the blind musician, two broken pieces somehow finding each other in this rough country. The whispers followed them out the door, but he'd long since learned to ignore them. The sun was high overhead as they emerged, its warmth a stark contrast to the coolness inside. Charlotte tilted her face upward as if seeking the light she could no longer see. "Is it a nice day, Mr. Stone?" she asked. "I can feel the sun, but I've found weather to be about more than just temperature." Ezra squeezed her hand where it rested on his arm once for yes, a system he'd developed over the years. "Good," she said with a small smile. "I've had enough of rain and cold to last a lifetime." He led her to his horse, setting her trunk and violin case on the ground beside them. The journey back to his ranch would take several hours, and they would have to ride double. He took her hand and guided it to the stallion's neck, letting her feel the smooth coat and strong muscle beneath. "He's beautiful, isn't he?" she murmured, her fingers gentle as they explored. "What's his name?" Ezra made no response, the futility of the question hanging between them. Charlotte laughed softly, a genuine sound this time. "I apologize. I'm still adjusting to our ... unique situation." She paused. "Perhaps you could squeeze my hand once for each letter. It would be slow, but we might manage his name before nightfall." Ezra considered this, then squeezed her hand 5 times. "E?" she guessed. Another squeeze. "C-H-O," she continued as he counted out each letter. "Echo. A fine name for a horse belonging to a silent man." Ezra lifted her trunk and secured it to the saddle, then carefully attached the violin case so it wouldn't be damaged during the ride. Finally, he placed his hands on Charlotte's waist, hesitating just long enough to communicate his intent before lifting her onto the horse. He mounted behind her, one arm wrapped securely around her middle as he took the reins with his free hand. As they rode out of Redemption Creek, Charlotte sat stiffly at first, unused to horseback and clearly uncomfortable with the stranger at her back. But as the miles passed and the sounds of the town faded behind them, she gradually relaxed, her body finding the rhythm of Echo's steady gait. "I can smell pine," she remarked after a while, "and something wild sage, perhaps. Nothing like Boston." She tilted her head slightly. "I imagine it's beautiful here in a harsh sort of way." Ezra squeezed her arm once, and so they continued toward his ranch, the silent cowboy and the blind woman, each carrying their own darkness, neither knowing that in the other they might find an unexpected light. The sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains when Ezra's ranch came into view. It wasn't a grand affair, a modest cabin with a wide porch, a sturdy barn, and a corral where 3 horses grazed peacefully. A small creek wound through the property, its surface glittering in the late afternoon light. To most, it would seem isolated, perhaps even desolate, but to Ezra, it was sanctuary. "Are we nearly there?" Charlotte asked, her back straight despite hours in the saddle. "The air is changed. It smells different." Ezra squeezed her arm once for yes, then guided Echo toward the cabin. As they approached, a dog came bounding from the porch, black and white border collie with one ear that stood straight and another that flopped over. It circled the horse excitedly, barking a welcome. "A dog?" Charlotte asked, turning her head toward the sound. "What kind?" Ezra had no way to answer, but he guided her hand down so she could feel the dog once they dismounted. Echo came to a stop before the cabin, and Ezra slid off first, then carefully helped Charlotte down. Her legs wobbled beneath her, unaccustomed to riding. He steadied her with his hands at her waist until she found her balance. "Thank you," she said, smoothing her skirt with trembling fingers. The dog approached cautiously, sniffing at her dress. Charlotte held out her hand. "Hello there." Ezra watched as the collie sniffed her palm, then nudged against it, allowing her to touch his head. Charlotte's face brightened with a smile, the first genuine one he'd seen from her. "What's his name?" she asked, then caught herself. "Oh, I'm sorry. I keep forgetting." Her fingers continued to stroke the dog's fur. "He's soft, well cared for." Ezra guided her hand to feel the dog's uneven ears. Then the white blazed down his muzzle. "One ear up, one down," she observed, "and a white stripe on his face." When Ezra squeezed her arm once, she smiled again. "He sounds handsome." While Charlotte became acquainted with the dog, Ezra untied her trunk and violin case from Echo's saddle. He carried them to the porch, then returned to offer Charlotte his arm. Leading her carefully, he helped her navigate the 3 steps up to the porch and through the cabin door. Inside, the cabin was simple but well maintained. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a rocking chair and small sofa arranged before it. A solid oak table with 4 chairs stood in what served as the kitchen area. At the back, partially screened by a curtain, was Ezra's sleeping quarters. A bed, chest of drawers, and a small stand with a basin and pitcher. Opposite that was a second small room, seldom used, with a narrow bed and a chest for storage. Charlotte stood just inside the doorway, her head tilted as if listening to the space around her. Wood floors, she noted, and a fire. I can smell the ash. It's warm in here. She reached out tentatively with one hand and Ezra guided it to the back of the rocking chair. He left her to explore the main room while he carried her trunk to the small bedroom. It would be hers now, though he'd need to make improvements. Perhaps a rug beside the bed so her feet wouldn't touch cold floors in the morning, and hooks for her dresses, within easy reach. When he returned, Charlotte had found her way to the kitchen table and was running her fingers along its surface. Your home is neat, she observed. I don't sense clutter. Do you live alone, Mr. Stone? Ezra squeezed her hand once. No family? He hesitated, then squeezed twice for no. I see. She bit her lip. I should tell you, Mr. Stone, that while I cannot see, I am fully capable of many tasks. I can cook, though I'll need to learn the layout of your kitchen. A keen sew and tend to household matters. I don't wish to be a burden. Ezra touched her shoulder gently, then guided her to the sofa and encouraged her to sit. The journey had been long, and she must be exhausted. He moved to the fireplace, adding logs and stoking the embers until flames flickered to life. The dog settled at Charlotte's feet, his head resting on his paws. What am I to call your dog, she asked, since I can't know his name. Ezra considered this, then crossed to her and took her hand. He traced the letter S on her palm. S? Her brow furrowed beneath the blindfold. Is that his name? He traced more letters. H-O-W. Shadow, she said, smiling. That's lovely. And fitting for a black and white dog, I imagine. Ezra nodded, though she couldn't see it. He'd forgotten how limiting their communication would be, him unable to speak, her unable to see his gestures. They would need to develop a system beyond simple yes and no. He moved to the kitchen and began preparing a simple supper: beans, salt pork, and cornbread left from the previous day. As he worked, Charlotte remained on the sofa, her hands folded in her lap. The stiffness had returned to her posture. Stone, she said after a while, I hope you'll forgive my directness, but I'm rather at a loss. I don't know what's expected of me here. The terms of my contract were ... vague. I was told I'd work as a housekeeper or companion, but given our unique circumstances, I'm uncertain how to proceed. Ezra paused in his work. She was right to be confused, perhaps even frightened. A blind woman sent to an isolated ranch with a mute stranger, it was hardly an ideal situation. He wiped his hands and returned to her, sitting beside her on the sofa. Taking her hand, he traced S-A-F-E. I'm safe here? When he squeezed once, she exhaled slowly. Thank you for that assurance. I've learned to be cautious. He hesitated, then traced again. HLP. You need help, she translated. With the house? The cooking? After his affirmation, she nodded. I can manage that, though I'll need guidance at first, and time to learn the layout of everything. Ezra squeezed her hand gently, hoping to convey his patience. Then he remembered her violin case still sitting by the door. He retrieved it and placed it carefully in her lap. Charlotte's expression transformed, her hands immediately moving to caress the worn leather case. My violin, she breathed. You brought it in. She unlatched the case and opened it, her fingers finding the instrument within. It was well loved, the wood smooth from years of handling. It's my most treasured possession, she explained as she lifted it from its velvet lining. My father gave it to me when I was 7. After I lost my sight, it became my voice. Ezra sat in the rocking chair, watching as she removed the violin completely and tucked it under her chin. Her posture changed, confidence replacing uncertainty as she drew the bow across the strings in a gentle tuning. The notes filled the cabin, vibrating through the walls and settling in Ezra's chest. When she began to play in earnest, it was a melody he didn't recognize. Something classical, perhaps, with sweeping phrases that rose and fell like breath. Her fingers moved with certainty, finding each note without hesitation. Her body swayed slightly with the music, and for the first time, Ezra could see beyond the blindness, beyond the gray dress and hesitant move. He saw the musician, passionate and skilled. Shadow's ears perked up, his head tilted as he listened. Even the fire seemed to dance in time with the notes that filled every corner of the cabin, transforming the simple space into something transcendent. As Charlotte played, Ezra found himself transported. It had been years since he'd heard music like this, not the rough fiddle tunes from saloon, but something pure and moving. His eyes burned and he blinked rapidly, surprised by the emotion welling within him. The melody shifted, becoming something slower, more melancholy. Charlotte's face reflected the music: joy, sorrow, longing, emotions Ezra had locked away for so long they felt foreign to him now. When the final note faded, silence returned, but it was different somehow. The cabin felt fuller, as if the music lingered in the air around them. Charlotte lowered the violin, her chest rising and falling with slightly quickened breath. I hope that wasn't unwelcome, she said softly. Music helps me make sense of new places. It tells me about the space, the way sound bounces off walls and furniture. And it ... single quotes, she hesitated. It helps me feel less afraid. Ezra moved from the rocking chair to sit beside her again. His hand found hers and he squeezed it once firmly. You liked it? A small smile curved her lips. When he squeezed again, her smile widened. I'm glad. I have many more pieces I could play for you. He traced on her palm, P-L-A-S-E. Charlotte nodded, her fingers closing around his briefly before she raised the violin once more. This time the melody was lighter, almost playful, like sunlight dancing on water. As she played, Ezra rose and returned to preparing their meal. the music following him through the cabin. For the first time in years, the silence that had been his constant companion was filled with something beautiful, and watching Charlotte transform as she played, her face alive with expression, he felt something shift within his chest. A loosening of the tightly bound grief he'd carried for so long. That night, after Charlotte had retired to her room and Ezra lay in his bed staring at the ceiling, the melodies still echoed in his mind. He realized with a start that the day had brought more than just a housekeeper to his door. It had brought color back to a world that had long ago faded to shades of gray. The first week at Ezra's ranch passed in a series of small discoveries and adjustments. For Charlotte, it was a matter of mapping the cabin in her mind, 15 steps from her bedroom to the front door, 7 steps to the kitchen table, 3 careful steps down from the porch. She counted and memorized, her hands constantly outstretched, learning the shape of her new world through touch. For Ezra, the challenge was different. He'd lived alone for so long that sharing his space required a conscious effort. He found himself watching Charlotte navigate the cabin, resisting the urge to guide her when she moved deliberately from one point to another, giving her the dignity of independence while remaining close enough to intervene if needed. They developed a rhythm of sorts. In the mornings, Ezra would rise first, start the fire, and put coffee on to boil. The aroma would wake Charlotte, who would emerge from her room with her hair neatly braided, feeling her way to the kitchen where she would prepare a simple breakfast while Ezra tended to the animals outside. On the third morning, Ezra returned from the barn to find Charlotte at the stove, flipping pancakes with surprising dexterity. She had tied a piece of string across the kitchen area, from the stove to the sink, a guide that allowed her to move between the two without confusion. "Good morning, Mr. Stone," she said, tilting her head toward the sound of his footsteps. "I hope you don't mind the string. I thought it might help me be more efficient." Ezra approached and squeezed her arm once, impressed by her ingenuity. He noticed other changes as well, cups and plates arranged in specific patterns, a small bell placed on the table that she would ring if she needed assistance while he was outside. After breakfast, Charlotte insisted on learning more about the ranch. "Can't see it," she explained, "but I'd like to know it. The sounds, the smells, the feel of it." Ezra hesitated. The terrain was uneven, with rocks and dips that could easily cause her to stumble, but her determined expression convinced him. He offered his arm, which she took gratefully, and led her outside. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine from the nearby forest and the earthy smell of the creek. Ezra guided Charlotte carefully across the yard, allowing her to pause whenever she wished to explore something with her hands. The rough bark of the old oak tree beside the house, the weathered wood of the fence post, the cold stone of the well. When they reached the barn, Charlotte's face brightened at the sounds of animals shifting in their stalls. Ezra led her to each horse, letting her touch their noses and feel the texture of their manes. She laughed with delight when one of the mares nuzzled her palm, searching for treats. "What color is this one?" she asked, stroking the mare's neck. Ezra took her hand and traced Chestnut. Chestnut, Charlotte repeated. "Like my hair," my mother used to say. Her smile dimmed slightly. "Sometimes forget colors. It's been 3 years since the fever took my sight. The doctor said it was a miracle I survived it all, though some days I wondered if it was a miracle or a curse." Ezra squeezed her hand gently. He understood all too well the complex grief of surviving when something essential had been taken. "It's better now," she continued, her fingers still stroking the horse's neck. "I've learned to live differently, to find beauty in texture and sound rather than sight." She turned her face toward him. "What's about you, Mr. Stone? How long has it been since you lost your voice?" Ezra guided her hand to his and tapped her palm 15 times. 15 years, she translated. "You were young then." He tapped again twice. 20? You were 20 years old." She was quiet for a moment. "May I ask what happened? Or is that too forward of me?" Ezra hesitated. Few people knew the true story. Most assumed it was a war injury or an accident. It was simpler to let them believe what they wished. But something about Charlotte's directness, her own vulnerability in discussing her blindness, made him want to share the truth. He led her to a hay bale in the corner of the barn and helped her sit. Then, sitting beside her, he took her hand and began to trace letters. It was slow work, and his fingers cramped with the effort of communication he'd long abandoned. But Charlotte was patient, repeating each word as she understood it. "ARO wrote a THRO at E, COUX, a TTSEK. An arrow in your throat," she said softly, "during a Sioux attack." Her hand reached out, hovering near his neck. "May I?" Ezra took her fingers and guided them to the scar that ran across his throat, a puckered line where the arrowhead had torn through skin and muscle, damaging his vocal cords beyond repair. Her touch was gentle as she traced the length of it, her expression solemn. "You survived," she said. It wasn't a question, but Ezra squeezed her hand once anyway. "Thank you for telling me." She withdrew her hand, folding it with her other in her lap. "It seems we're quite the pair, Mr. Stone. Both of us a little broken, according to the world." Ezra frowned at that characterization. Taking her hand again, he traced a note, BRO. Canen. Charlotte's lips curved slightly. "Just different then." "Yes. I like that better." She tilted her head, listening to the horses shifting in their stalls. "It's peaceful here. Different from Boston. There it was always noise carriages, voices, vendors calling their wares. When I lost my sight, the noise became overwhelming. I couldn't sort through it anymore." Ezra touched her arm to prompt her to continue. He found himself curious about her life before. What had led a blind Boston woman to sign an indentured contract that brought her west? After my parents died, first father, then mother a year later, I had few options. I taught music for a while, but students became scarce. People didn't trust a blind teacher regardless of skill. Her fingers twisted together. My cousin offered to take me in, but his wife made it clear I wasn't welcome. When I heard about the settlement company seeking people for the West, it seemed a chance to start fresh. They promised placement with a family that would value my skills. She laughed, a hollow sound unlike her usual warmth. I didn't expect to be auctioned off like a piece of furniture, but then I didn't expect many things that life has given me. Ezra took her hand and traced R-E-G-R-E-T. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment. Her face turned toward the open barn door where sunlight streamed in. No, he finally said. I don't believe I do. Not yet, at least. She smiled, a genuine expression this time. You've been kind, Mr. Stone, and your home is becoming familiar. I just hope I am earning my keep. Ezra squeezed her hand once firmly. In the week she'd been there, the cabin had transformed. It wasn't just the physical changes, the strings and bells and carefully arranged item, but something less tangible. The emptiness that had permeated the space for so long had receded. Her music filled the evenings, and even her quiet humming while she worked brought life to rooms that had held only silence before. The dinner hour found them back in the cabin, Charlotte at the stove stirring a pot of stew while Ezra set the table. The routine they'd established was comfortable, requiring few words. Charlotte had tied a new string from the stove to the table, allowing her to serve the meal with minimal assistance. Stone, she said as they sat to eat, I've been thinking. Our method of communication works well enough, but it's terribly slow. Perhaps we could develop something more efficient? A kind of dot code between us? Ezra tapped the table once in agreement. For instance, if you tap twice quickly, then once slowly, that could mean, would you like something? She demonstrated the pattern with her fingers, and I could respond with the same pattern for yes, or perhaps 3 slow taps for no, over the meal. They developed a dozen such signals, different patterns of taps, squeezes, and touches that could convey common questions and responses without the laborious process of spelling each word. By the time they finished eating, they had established a rudimentary language of their own. That evening, as had become their custom, Charlotte played her violin while Ezra sat in the rocking chair by the fire. Shadow curled at her feet, his tail thumping occasionally. She played from memory pieces by composers Ezra had never heard of, but which stirred something deep within him nonetheless. Between songs, she began to tell stories of her childhood in Boston, her father's work as a professor of literature, her mother's garden that bloomed with flowers she could now only remember. She spoke of concerts attended, books her father had read aloud, the taste of sea salt in the air near the harbor. In return, Ezra would take her hand between melodies and trace brief stories of his own. The cattle drive he'd led before his injury, the mountains he'd explored, the bear he'd once encountered fishing in the creek behind the cabin. Their communication was still halting, but with each passing day it flowed more naturally. As Charlotte played her final piece for the night, something slow and sweet that made the flames seem to dance in harmony, Ezra realized that in just 1 week his world had expanded. For years he had lived in isolation, his inability to speak a wall between himself and others. But with Charlotte, silence wasn't a barrier. It was simply the space between notes, the canvas upon which their unique language was written. 3 weeks into Charlotte's stay, the first signs of winter appeared. Mornings dawned with frost silvering the grass, and the evenings grew sharper, kind of cold that settled deep in the bones. Ezra knew they needed supplies from town: flour, sugar, coffee, and winter clothing for Charlotte, whose thin eastern dresses were hardly suited to Montana winters. At breakfast, he tapped out their newly established pattern for town, followed by the question signal they had developed. Charlotte paused, her spoon halfway to her lip. You want to go to town today? Ezra tapped once for yes, then added the pattern for need and supplies. I see. Her fingers tightened around her spoon. Will I? Would you like me to accompany you? Ezra considered this. It would be easier to leave her at the ranch, but she needed proper winter clothing and the items would need to fit. Besides, she'd been confined to the cabin and immediate surroundings since her arrival. Perhaps a change of scenery, even one she couldn't see, would do her good. He tapped once, then touched her arm in the pattern they used for reassurance. All right, she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her shoulders. I'll need to change into something more presentable. An hour later, they were on their way, Charlotte seated before Ezra on Echo, her back straight and her hands clutching the saddle horn. She wore her best dress, a navy blue wool that had seen better days but was still dignified. Her hair was pinned neatly beneath a simple bonnet, and she'd removed the blindfold, revealing eyes that appeared normal at first glance, a warm hazel color but remained fixed and unseen. Is it beautiful today? She asked as they rode. I can feel the sun, but there's a chill in the air. Ezra squeezed her arm once, then traced on her shoulder. K-U-E-E-E-B-E-U-E-G-O-L D. Clouds against blue sky. And golden dot. She paused. Leaves? Is it the aspens turning? Another squeeze for a yes. The aspens that lined the creek had transformed in the past week, their leaves shimmering gold in the October light. I remember autumn colors, Charlotte said softly. The way the world seemed to catch fire before the gray of winter. Sometimes I dream in color still, though I fear I'm forgetting shades. Blue especially. There are so many kinds of blue, Ezra wished. Not for the first time that he could describe things properly for her. His tracing was too cumbersome for lengthy descriptions and their tap language too limited for nuance. But he did his best, tapping out rhythms that meant beautiful and bright as they rode. The 2-hour journey to town passed pleasantly enough, with Charlotte occasionally humming or asking questions about the ranch. As they approached Redemption Creek, however, her posture stiffened. I hear the town, she said. People. Horses. Her hand found Ezra's where it rested at her waist. I haven't been around many people since losing my sight. In Boston, children would sometimes, they weren't always kind. Ezra squeezed her fingers gently, understanding her apprehension all too well. The town had never been a comfortable place for him either. People stared, whispered, treated him as something less for his inability to speak. He'd learned to ignore it, to focus on his business and leave, but he couldn't shield Charlotte from what she might hear. They rode down the main street, past the saloon and general store. As expected, their arrival drew attention. Conversations halted, heads turned, eyes followed. A woman with a child pulled her son closer as they passed, as if blindness might be catching. They're staring at us, aren't they? Charlotte whispered. Ezra squeezed her arm once, seeing no point in lying. I thought so. I can feel it. The silence, then the whispers. She straightened her spine even further. My father always said, keep your dignity when others forget theirs. They stopped at the general store and Ezra dismounted first, then helped Charlotte down. Her legs were steadier now after weeks of riding lessons around the ranch, but she still clung to his arm as they approached the store's entrance. The 3 wooden steps presented a challenge, but she navigated them carefully with Ezra's guidance. Inside, this store smelled of coffee, leather, and the sharp tang of pickles and barrels. Mrs. Winters, the storekeeper's wife, was helping another customer but stopped mid-sentence when she saw them enter. M.R. Stone, she said, recovering her composure. It's been a while. Her eyes moved to Charlotte, curious but not unkind. And you must be Miss Harlow. News travels in a small town. Yes, ma'am, Charlotte replied, her voice clear and steady despite her grip on Ezra's arm. It's a pleasure to meet you. Mrs. Winters approached, her skirts rustling. Mayor Hollister mentioned you're from Boston. That's quite a change. Indeed it is, Charlotte said with a small smile. But Mr. Stone's ranch is becoming home. Single quotes. Ezra handed Mrs. Winters the list he'd prepared, watching as she scanned it. Quite a large order, she commented. Preparing for winter, I see. And women's clothing? She looked at Charlotte appraising. We don't have much selection, but I can show you what we have in stock. That would be lovely, Charlotte said, though I'll need your guidance as I can't see the items. Mrs. Winters' expression soft. Of course, dear. Let me finish with Merce Peterson, and then I'll help you personally. While Mrs. Winters completed her transaction with the other customer, Ezra guided Charlotte to a quiet corner of the store. He could feel eyes on them from the few other shoppers present, their gazes a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. A young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, edged closer, staring openly at Charlotte's unseeing eyes. Why don't your eyes move, lady? He asked bluntly. Timothy, his mother scolded, hurrying over to pull him away. I apologize, she said to Charlotte. Children can be so thoughtless. Charlotte shook her head. It's all right. Children are curious by nature. She turned in the direction of the boy's voice. I'm blind, young man. I had a fever that damaged the part of my eyes that sees. They look normal, but they don't work anymore. Does it hurt? Timothy asked, ignoring his mother's attempts to shush him. No, it doesn't hurt, but it does mean I need help sometimes, she smiled. Like your friend, Mr. Stone here, who guides me around town. He ain't much of a talker, Timothy observed. Charlotte's smile widened. No, but he has other ways of communicating. Sometimes the quietest people have the most to say if you learn how to listen. The boy seemed to consider this, then asked, can you play games? Timothy, that's enough, his mother insisted, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. We need to go. Again, I apologize. As they left, Mrs. Winters approached. Well handled, she said to Charlotte. That boy asks everyone uncomfortable questions. Now about those clothes, I have some sturdy winter dresses that might suit. Would you like to feel the fabric? For the next hour, Ezra watched as Mrs. Winters patiently helped Charlotte select clothing. 2 wool dresses, warm stocking, a heavy shawl, and a proper winter coat lined with rabbit fur. The storekeeper's wife described each item in detail, guiding Charlotte's hands to feel the materials and explaining the colors and styles. While the women were occupied, Ezra gathered the other supplies on his list. As he reached for a sack of flour, a voice spoke behind him. Didn't expect to see you with company, Stone. Ezra turned to find Sheriff Dawson leaning against a shelf, his expression unreadable. Folks are talking, the sheriff continued in a low voice. Some think it ain't right. A man in your condition looking after a blind woman. Some are saying worse things. He adjusted his hat. I told them to mind their business, but you know how people are in small towns. They'll find something to gossip about if it kills them. Ezra nodded his thanks for the warning. How's she settling in? Dawson asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. Ezra raised his hand, palm flat, and tipped it from side to side in a so-so gesture. Takes time, I reckon. Winter's coming early this year, according to old Blackfoot Joe. Says the squirrels are gathering extra quick. The sheriff straightened. You need anything, you let me know. Not everyone in town's a busybody. After the sheriff moved on, Ezra finished gathering their supplies. By the time he'd arranged for everything to be loaded into a wagon he'd rented for the day, Charlotte had completed her purchases with Mrs. Winters' assistance. Your Miss Harlow is quite remarkable, Mrs. Winters told Ezra as he paid their bill. Educated, well-spoken, not what one expects from an indentured servant. She lowered her voice. And between us, I think she's good for you, Mr. Stone. You seem... less burdened somehow. Outside, they encountered more curious stares as Ezra helped Charlotte into the wagon. Just as they were about to depart, a group of men emerged from the saloon across the street. Well, look who's in town, one called out. Frank Miller, a ranch hand known for his quick temper and quicker tongue, the mute and his blind bargain bride. Now that's a match made in heaven. She can't see how ugly he is, and he can't tell her how pitiful she looks. Laughter rose from the group, harsh and mocking. Ezra's hands tightened on the reins, his jaw clenched. Beside him, Charlotte stiffened, her face paling. Ignore them, she whispered. Please, Mr. Stone. But Miller wasn't finished. He staggered into the street, emboldened by whiskey and an audience. Hey, Stone, how much did you pay for her? Must have been a bargain price for damaged goods. Ezra started to rise, fury burning through his veins, but Charlotte's hand found his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. They're not worth it, she said, her voice low but firm. Take me home, please. Take me home. The plea in her voice doused the rage within him. Ezra settled back onto the seat and snapped the reins, guiding the wagon past the jeering men. As they left town behind, Charlotte remained silent, her face turned away, but he could see the slight tremble of her shoulders. Only when the sounds of town had faded completely did she speak again, her voice barely audible over the creak of the wagon wheels. Thank you for not confronting them, she said. Violence would only have confirmed what they think of us. She paused. People fear what they don't understand. My father taught me that. And when people fear, they can be cruel. Ezra reached over and took her hand, squeezing it once. Yes, she said, correctly interpreting his meaning. We're better than that. Better than them. She turned her face toward him, her unseeing eyes damp with unshed tears. I'm glad to be going home. Our home. The words hung in the air between them as the wagon continued down the trail, the gold-tipped aspens lining their path like silent guardians. Home. Something neither of them had truly had in years. Something they were, against all odds, building together. Winter arrived with uncompromising swiftness. One morning in early November, Charlotte woke to a profound silence, the kind of hush that only comes when snow blankets the world. The air in her small room was sharp with cold, and she pulled the quilts tighter around herself, reluctant to leave their warmth. Shadow, she called softly. The border collie had taken to sleeping on a rug beside her bed, a silent guardian through the night. She heard the thump of his tail against the floor, then the soft patting of his paws as he approached. His cold nose nudged her outstretched hand. Is it snowing, boy? She asked, scratching behind his ears. It sounds like snow. The dog offered no confirmation, of course, but Charlotte had learned to read the world through her other senses. The distinctive stillness, the crispness of the air, the way sound seemed muffled, all pointed to snow. She sat up, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed, her toes curling at the touch of the cold wooden floor. Ezra had placed a thick rug beside her bed, but in the night it had shifted. She found it with her feet and stood, reaching for the heavy wool dress hanging on a peg near the bed. Mrs. Winters had been thorough in her assistance, selecting practical clothing that Charlotte could easily distinguish by texture. This dress was thick and slightly rough, with buttons down the front that her fingers could easily find. Once dressed, she navigated to the main room by trailing her hand along the wall. The cabin was silent save for the occasional pop from the fireplace, where embers from the previous night still glowed. Ezra must already be outside tending to the animals. Charlotte made her way to the stove, adding wood from the nearby box and stirring the coals until the kindling caught. Then she filled the coffee pot with water from the bucket Ezra always left full each night. These morning rituals had become second nature now, her hands moving with confidence born of repetition and necessity. As the coffee began to percolate, filling the cabin with its rich aroma, she heard the front door open. A blast of cold air swept in, along with the sound of boots stomping to clear snow. Good morning, Mr. Stone, she called, turning toward the sound. It's snowing, isn't it? Ezra crossed to her and touched her arm, tapping once. Then his cold fingers found her hand and traced H-A-E-Y S-N-O-W. Heavy snow, she repeated. How much? He traced again. K-N-E. Charlotte's eyebrows rose. Any deep? Already? It's only November. E-R-L-Y. O-I-R-L-I-A-R. He paused, then added C-O-L-D. "You must be frozen," she said, concern coloring her voice. "Sit by the fire. I'll bring coffee." She heard him move away, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight. Shadow followed him, nails clicking against the wood. Charlotte poured 2 cups of coffee, adding sugar to Ezra's preference she'd discovered during their weeks. Carrying them carefully, she followed the sound of crackling flames until the warmth of the fire touched her face. "Here," she said, extending 1 cup in the direction of the heat. Ezra's fingers brushed hers as he took the coffee, and he tapped twice on her wrist in thanks. The gesture was small but familiar, one of dozens they'd developed in their unique language of touch. Charlotte found her way to the rocking chair opposite Ezra's seat and settled into it, cradling her own cup in her hands. The heat seeped into her fingers, a welcome comfort against the morning chill. "Will the animals be all right?" she asked. "In the snow, I mean." Ezra tapped once for yes, then traced BARNWRM. "That's good. And do we have enough firewood for winter?" Another tap for yes, followed by STACKDIGH. Charlotte nodded, relieved. During her weeks at the ranch, she'd come to understand the rhythm of preparations. The stockpiling of feed and firewood, the sealing of drafty windows with cloth, the moving of tools and necessities into the barn to avoid long treks through snow. Ezra had been thorough, his years of experience evident in the methodical way he'd prepared for the coming season. "What will we do today?" she asked, sipping her coffee. With the snow so deep, Ezra was quiet for a moment, and Charlotte imagined him looking out the window, considering the day ahead. Finally, his hand found hers and traced, "Still Y, INSID. A day indoors." Then she said with a smile, "I don't mind that. I could bake bread and perhaps mend that shirt of yours. I felt the tear in the sleeve yesterday." They settled into a companionable routine after breakfast. Ezra worked at the table, the rhythmic sound of his knife against leather telling Charlotte he was repairing a harness or saddle. She kneaded dough at the kitchen counter, her fingers working by memory and feel, a skill her mother had taught her long ago. As the bread rose near the fire, Charlotte retrieved her sewing basket from her room. She'd organized it meticulously, different spools of thread marked by small knots tied in specific patterns, needles of varying sizes stored in a pincushion, buttons and patches in separate pouches she could identify by touch. "Miss Stone," she called, "may I have your torn shirt? I noticed it yesterday when you returned from the barn." She heard him rise and move to his room, returning moments later. He pressed the garment into her hands, a heavy cotton work shirt with a tear along the right sleeve. Charlotte ran her fingers over the fabric until she found the damage. "This won't take long," she assured him, threading a needle with practiced ease. As she worked, she began to hum softly, one of the pieces she often played on her violin, a gentle melody that seemed suited to the quiet snowbound day. The fire crackled, Shadow occasionally sighed from his spot on the hearth, and outside the snow continued to fall, adding to the insulating silence that wrapped around the cabin. When the shirt was mended and the bread was baking, filling the cabin with its comforting aroma, Charlotte retrieved her violin from its case. It had become an afternoon ritual, a time when she would play while Ezra listened, the music creating a bridge between their silent worlds. "Any requests today?" she asked, positioning the instrument under her chin. Ezra tapped twice on the table, their signal for the usual. Charlotte smiled and began to play. Bach's Violin Sonata No. 1 in G minor. It was Ezra's favorite, though he probably didn't know its name. He'd signaled his preference for it many times, tapping appreciatively whenever she played it. The piece was technically demanding, with its intricate fingerwork and precise bowing, but Charlotte lost herself in the familiar patterns, her body swaying slightly with the music. As the final notes faded, a new sound emerged, the howl of wind picking up outside, whistling through the eaves of the cabin. Charlotte lowered her violin, head tilted toward the window. "Storm is getting worse," she observed. Ezra crossed to her side and touched her arm, guiding her to the window. He placed her hand against the glass and she gasped at the cold that seeped through. He then traced against her palm, "Belize. S-A-R-D. A full blizzard?" she asked, concern threading through her voice. "Will the animals be safe?" CHEKSOO. And the wind continued to strengthen throughout the afternoon, its moan becoming a howl that seemed to circle the cabin like a hungry predator. Charlotte found herself gravitating toward the fire, its warmth a counterpoint to the growing fury outside. She played her violin again, this time selecting pieces that complemented the storm, dramatic and sweeping, a musical conversation with the elements. As evening approached, Ezra prepared to check the barn. Charlotte heard him pulling on his heavy coat and boots by the door. "Be careful," she urged, setting aside her violin. "The wind sounds dangerous." Crossed back to where she sat and squeezed her hand reassuringly, then traced ROPE. "You'll use a rope to guide yourself back," she clarified, remembering the technique he'd explained days earlier, a safety measure when visibility was poor. He tapped once for yes, then opened the door. A blast of frigid air rushed in, along with the full-throated roar of the storm. Charlotte heard him step out, then the solid thunk of the door closing behind him. She sat very still, listening to the storm's assault on the cabin. Minutes stretched longer than they should have, and anxiety began to build in her chest. She rose and paced, counting steps from the fireplace to the table, from the table to the door, and back again. Shadow wind, sensing her distress. He'll be fine, she told the dog and herself. He knows this land. He's lived through winters before. But her reassurance rang hollow as time passed. The fire needed tending, so she carefully added logs. Listening to the snap and pop of the flames, she moved to the stove and stirred the stew they'd prepared earlier, the familiar motions providing little comfort. Just as she was considering whether to brave the storm herself, foolish notion, she knew the door finally opened. The wind's howl was momentarily deafening, then muffled again as the door shut. But something was wrong. The footsteps were uneven, halting. "Mr. Stone?" Charlotte called, moving toward the sound. "Ezra?" Her outstretched hands found him leaning against the wall, his breathing labored. His clothes were stiff with cold. Ice crusted in his beard. He slumped against her as she guided him toward the fire, his weight nearly toppling her. "What happened?" she asked, helping him to his chair. "Are you hurt?" His hand found hers, fingers clumsy with cold and trace shake. "VLL, Leggy." Charlotte knelt beside him, her hands moving carefully down to his right leg. He flinched when she touched his ankle, and she felt the unnatural swelling beneath his pant leg. "You've injured your ankle," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "We need to get these wet clothes off you first. Then I'll look at your leg." For the first time since her arrival, their roles were reversed. Now it was Charlotte who guided Ezra, helping him remove his frozen coat and boots, bringing him dry clothes, and examining his injury with careful hands. The ankle was swollen and hot to the touch, though she couldn't tell if it was broken or merely sprained. She wrapped it tightly with strips of cloth, working by feel and memory from the times she'd assisted her mother with similar injuries in Boston. Throughout her ministrations, Ezra remained silent, not just in voice but in movement. The usual taps and squeezes that formed his side of their conversations were absent, replaced by a stillness that worried Charlotte more than the injury itself. By morning, Ezra's ankle had swollen to twice its normal size, and a deep purple bruise spread from beneath the wrappings. Charlotte changed the bandages, her fingers gentle but certain as they worked. She'd spent the night in the rocking chair beside his bed, dozing fitfully, waking at his slightest movement to offer water or adjust his pillows. "The swelling is worse," she told him, carefully rewrapping the injury. "I don't think it's broken. The bones seem aligned, but it's a bad sprain. You won't be able to walk on it for some time." Ezra tapped his fingers against her arm, a gesture of frustration rather than communication. "I know," she said softly. "It's difficult to be confined." She understood immobility all too well. Her own world had contracted dramatically when blindness claimed her sight. She straightened, pushing a strand of hair back from her face. "The animals still need tending, and we need firewood brought in. You'll have to tell me what to do." Ezra's hand found hers, and he traced rapidly. "Dia Ungur Russ." "Perhaps," she agreed, "but necessary. We have no neighbors to call upon, and the storm hasn't let up." She squeezed his hand. "Guide me through it. I can be your eyes, and you can be my knowledge." After breakfast, they developed a plan. Ezra traced detailed instructions on Charlotte's palm, which animals needed what feed, where everything was stored in the barn, how to check the water troughs to ensure they weren't frozen solid. She listened intently, committing each direction to memory. "I'll take Shadow with me," she said as she pulled on Ezra's spare coat, far too large but warmer than her own. "He can alert me to anything I might miss." Ezra caught her hand before she could move away, tracing urgently. "Criful. I will be," she promised. "I've become quite good at navigating without sight. The snow is just... ... Another challenge." She wrapped a scarf around her face, leaving only her unseeing eyes exposed, and found the coiled rope hanging by the door. Ezra had explained its use last night between bouts of pain, one end tied to the cabin porch, the other to her waist, a lifeline in the blinding snow. With Shadow at her side, Charlotte stepped into a world transformed. The cold hit her first, a biting chill that seeped through her layers of clothing. Then the sound, the persistent howl of wind whipping around the cabin corners, the creak and groan of trees bending under the storm's force. The snow was deep, each step requiring deliberate effort as she waded through drifts that reached past her knees. "Forward, Shadow," she commanded, trusting the dog's instincts to find the path to the barn. The rope played out behind her, a tether to safety. She counted steps, one hand outstretched, the other clutching Shadow's makeshift harness, a strip of leather Ezra had fashioned weeks ago during their walks around the ranch. The 20 yards to the barn might as well have been 20 miles. Twice she stumbled, falling forward into snow so deep it cushioned her fall. The second time disorientation seized her. Which way was forward? Which way back? Panic fluttered in her chest like a trapped bird. "Shadow," she called, her voice thin against the wind. "Where's the barn? Find the barn." The dog pressed against her leg, then moved forward, tugging gently at the harness. Charlotte followed, her trust in the animal absolute. Moments later, her outstretched hand struck solid wood. The barn. Relief coursed through her as she felt her way to the door and pulled it open, slipping inside with Shadow at her heels. The relative quiet within the barn was startling. Here, the storm's fury was muffled, replaced by the shuffling and snorting of anxious animals. Charlotte stood still, allowing her senses to orient her. The smell of hay and manure, the warmth of bodies, the shifting of hooves all created a map in her mind. "Let's get to work," she murmured to Shadow, untying the rope from her waist but leaving it attached to the door handle. She moved carefully through the tasks Ezra had outlined. She found the hay bales where he'd described, counting steps to each stall. The horses nickered nervously at her approach, unaccustomed to her presence without Ezra, but they settled when she spoke to them softly. "Easy there," she soothed Echo as she filled his trough. "I know I'm not who you expected." The water barrels had a thin layer of ice, which she broke with a tool Ezra had described, a metal rod hanging just inside the barn door. She refreshed water for each animal, checked that the barn walls were secure against the wind, and replenished feed where needed. By the time she finished, sweat dampened her back despite the cold. Her hands, even in thick gloves, were numb, and her legs ached from pushing through snow, but satisfaction warmed her from within. She had done what was needed despite her blindness. The return journey to the cabin was slightly easier, the rope guiding her directly back. Still, she was shaking with exhaustion when she finally stumbled through the door, snow falling from her clothes in clumps. "We did it," she announced to Ezra, pulling off the wet scarf. "The animals are fed and watered. The barn is secure." She moved to the fire, hands outstretched to the heat, though I won't pretend it was easy. Ezra thumped his hand against the arm of his chair, their signal for approval and pride. The pattern of their days shifted with Ezra's injury. Each morning, Charlotte would rise before dawn to tend the animals, following the safety rope through snow that continued to accumulate. After the third day, she no longer needed Ezra's detailed instructions. Having committed the routine to memory, she learned to recognize each animal by sound and smell, to feel the difference between types of feed, to judge whether water was sufficiently thawed. Inside the cabin, she cooked, cleaned, and tended to Ezra's injury, changing bandages and applying cold compresses when the swelling worsened. She played her violin in the evenings, selecting cheerful, lively tunes to combat the monotony of their confinement. Ezra, for his part, struggled with his enforced idleness. The first few days, he barely communicated, his usual taps and traces reduced to occasional squeezes of acknowledgement when Charlotte brought food or medicine. She felt his frustration like a physical presence in the cabine, a man accustomed to constant movement and work suddenly rendered immobile. On the fourth day, as Charlotte returned from the morning chores, she heard the distinctive sound of wood being carved. She followed the noise to find Ezra in his chair, a piece of pine in one hand, his pocket knife in the other. "What are you making?" she asked, removing her snow-covered outer garments. He took her hand and guided it to the wood. Her fingers traced the beginnings of a shape, something small and delicate. "A bird?" she guessed. He tapped once for yes, then traced Foryu. "Thank you," she said, genuinely touched. "It's good that you've found something to occupy your hands that evening." After supper, Charlotte sat beside the fire, darning a sock while Ezra continued his carving. The quiet domesticity of the moment struck her suddenly, how far they had come from that first awkward day when he'd brought her to the ranch. Then they had been strangers bound by a contract. Now they moved around each other with the ease of long acquaintance, anticipating needs, sharing space comfortably. "I've been thinking," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about names." Ezra paused in his carving, and she sensed his attention shifting to her. "You're always Mr. Stone to me, and I'm Miss Harlow to you. At least I assume that's how you think of me." She set her darning aside. "It seems rather formal, given our circumstance." She heard him set down his carving. A moment later, his hand found hers. "Iziara," he traced. "Ezra," she repeated, smiling. "And I'm Charlotte." She hesitated, then added, "Though my family called me Charlie. Ara, i.e., he traced, his touch lingering on her palm longer than necessary. "Yes," she said softly. "Charlie." The wind howled outside, rattling the windows in their frames, but within the cabin something shifted. A formality dropped away like a discarded coat. The following morning, Charlotte woke to an unusual silence. The persistent roar of the wind had ceased. She rose quickly, dressed, and made her way to the main room, where she found Ezra already awake in his chair. "The storm has passed?" she asked. He tapped once for yes, then traced SUNBRIGHT. Relief flooded through her. The blizzard had lasted nearly a week, the longest she'd ever experienced. She moved to the door and opened it, letting in a rush of crisp, cold air. The silence outside was profound, the deep hush of a world buried in snow. "How deep is it now?" she asked. IST, he traced when she returned to his side. "Waist high? That's extraordinary," she considered the implication. "The animals will need extra attention today. They'll be eager to move after being confined so long." As she prepared to go to the barn, Ezra caught her arm. His fingers traced urgently. CHEKROOF. The roof on the barn. When he tapped once, she nodded. "I'll be careful to listen for any creaking. Snow that heavy could cause damage." She bundled up and headed out, reveling in the relative ease of movement now that the wind had stopped. The world felt clean and new, the air so cold it seemed to crystallize in her lungs. Shadow bounded ahead, joyful at the change in weather. At the barn, Charlotte heard it immediately, a low, ominous creaking from above. She froze, head tilted back as if she could see the roof straining under its burden. Ezra had warned her of this possibility, that sometimes snow accumulated so heavily it could collapse structures. Moving carefully, she followed the wall to the corner where Ezra had told her restored. Her fingers found what she sought, a long-handled rake used for clearing snow from the roof edges. With Shadow safely inside the barn, she worked methodically around the perimeter, extending the rake upward to pull snow from the roof's edge. creating a buffer zone that might relieve some of the weight. It was exhausting work. Her arms ached and sweat trickled down her back despite the cold, but the creaking lessened as she cleared section after section. By the time she finished tending the animals and returned to the cabin, every muscle in her body protested. "I think I've prevented a collapse," she told Ezra as she shed her outer garments. For now, at least. He took her hand when she approached, turning it palm up. Her skin was raw and blistered from handling the rough wooden rake. His touch was gentle as he traced BROVEGIRL. "Not brave," she corrected, easing into the chair opposite his. "Just doing what needs to be done, as you would." His fingers traced again. SAMETHING. 2 weeks after the blizzard, the deep snow had settled and compacted, and paths had been worn between the cabin and barn from Charlotte's daily treks. The sun emerged more frequently, casting brilliant light across the white landscape, warming the cabin through its south-facing windows. Inside, another kind of thawing was taking place. Ezra's ankle had begun to heal, the swelling reduced enough that he could put slight weight on it with the aid of a crudely fashioned crutch. Charlotte heard him before she saw him that morning, the uneven thump of the crutch against the floor, followed by the careful placement of his good foot. She was at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal, when the sound reached her. "Ezra," she called, setting down the spoon, "are you walking?" The thumping continued until he reached the kitchen. His hand found her shoulder and squeezed once for yes. "That's wonderful," she said, reaching up to cover his hand with hers, "but please don't push too hard. A re-injury would set you back even further." He traced on her shoulder. "Styr, CROZSY." Charlotte laughed. "Cabin fever, is it? I understand. Being confined isn't easy." His fingers moved again. HLPTODOY. "You want to help with chores? Are you certain that's wise?" One tap. "Definitive." "All right," she conceded. "But only what your ankle can bear, and you'll use the crutch." Over breakfast, they planned the day. Ezra would accompany Charlotte to the barn, supervising while she tended the animals. Then, if his strength held, he would work at the repair bench in the barn, fixing tack and tools that had been neglected during his convalescence. Charlotte would return to the cabin to bake bread and prepare stew for the evening meal. They set out mid-morning, Charlotte carrying the rifle at Ezra's insistence. Though most predators stayed deep in the forest during winter, the leaner ones sometimes grew desperate enough to venture near human settlements. Ezra had taught her to load and fire the weapon during his recovery, guiding her hands through the motions until she could do it independently. She couldn't aim with any accuracy, of course, but at close range, the sound alone might scare off most threats. Their progress to the barn was slow, Ezra hobbling beside her, occasionally steadying himself with a hand on her shoulder. Charlotte matched her pace to his, hyper-aware of the labored rhythm of his breathing and the way he paused to rest his weight off the injured ankle. In the barn, she moved through her now familiar routine, feeding the horses, checking water troughs, refreshing hay in the stalls. Ezra settled at his workbench, the sounds of leather being worked and metal tools clinking a comforting backdrop to her tasks. "It feels different with you here," she commented as she finished. "The animals are calmer. They've missed you." Single quotes. Ezra tapped the bench twice, his signal for agreement. Then she heard him rise, the crutch scraping against the floor as he moved toward her. His hand found hers and traced. "Thianke, yo you." "For what?" she asked. "EVRU, for what?" she asked. "EVRU." The simple sentiment warmed her more than any fire could. "We take care of each other," she said softly. "It's what ... friends do." She hesitated on the word friends, unsure if it adequately described what they had become to each other. Was there a term for two broken people who had somehow found wholeness together? Back at the cabin, Charlotte set bread dough to rise and prepared vegetables for stew while Ezra rested in his chair, occasionally working on the wooden bird he was carving. The peaceful domesticity of their afternoon was interrupted by Shadow's sudden barking at the window, sharp, alert sounds that signaled something unusual. Charlotte set down her knife. "Why is it, boy?" Ezra's chair creaked as he rose, and she heard him move to the window. After a moment, he returned to her side, his hand finding hers. "Mian, Hura, men on horseback." Alarm coursed through her. "How many?" "DHREE. Do you recognize them?" "No." Strangers approaching an isolated cabin in winter rarely signaled anything good. Charlotte felt for the rifle they'd left propped by the door, ensuring it was loaded as Ezra had taught her. "What should we do?" WIT. Ezra moved away, and she heard him retrieve his own rifle from the rack on the wall. The minutes stretched taut as they listened to the approaching hoofbeats. Shadow continued to bark, his tone growing increasingly aggressive. Then came the sound of men's voices, indistinct at first, then clearer as they neared the cabin. "Looks occupied," one called. "Smoke from the chimney." "Might be Stone's place," another replied. "Remember what Miller said? Mute rancher, blind woman. It's easy pickings if they've got supplies." Charlotte's blood ran cold. These were not friendly visitors or lost travelers. They were here because of what Frank Miller had told them in town, because he'd painted Ezra and Charlotte as vulnerable. Ezra's hand closed around her arm, guiding her away from the door toward the corner of the room. He positioned her behind his chair, then moved back toward the entrance. She heard the distinctive sound of a rifle being cocked. A heavy knock rattled the door. "Hello inside?" A voice called, "We're travelers caught in the weather, looking for shelter and supplies." Silence followed. Ezra, of course, couldn't answer. The men outside grew impatient. "Open up. We know someone's in there." Charlotte felt a surge of anger replace her fear. These men thought them easy targets because of their disabilities. She stepped forward, one hand finding Ezra's shoulder. "I'll speak to them," she whispered. Then raising her voice, "My husband has a rifle trained on the door. State your business truthfully or leave our property." The word husband slipped out instinctively, a tactical choice. A married woman would have protection. A single one might be seen as available, vulnerable. "Now, no need for hostility," the voice replied, a false friendliness coating his words. "We're just looking for a warm place to wait out the cold. Maybe some food and coffee." "There's a town 15 miles east," Charlotte replied. "Redemption Creek. They have a hotel. That's a far piece in this weather," another voice complained. "We got cash. We'll pay for what we take." Ezra's hand found Charlotte's, squeezing twice for no. She understood his caution. Letting strangers into their home would be dangerous, especially with Ezra injured and her blind. "We can spare some food," she called, "but not shelter. My husband is recovering from fever. It could be catching." A murmured conversation took place outside, too quiet to discern. Then the first voice returned. "All right then, some food would be appreciated, and maybe some feed for our horses." Ezra tapped her hand once, agreeing to this compromise. Better to give them something and send them on their way than risk a confrontation. "Leave your weapons on the porch," Charlotte instructed. "My husband will pass out supplies, but you'll stay outside." More muttering. Then, "Fine." Charlotte heard the clatter of guns being set down. Ezra squeezed her hand, then traced, "Stay OI. Be a CK." She nodded and retreated to the far corner, keeping the rifle with her. Ezra approached the door, his movement hampered by his injury, but his determination evident in each step. She heard the door open slightly, then the rustle of a sack being passed outside. "Mighty little," the voice complained. Charlotte tensed, listening for any sign of aggression. Instead, she heard a new voice, older, more measured. "It's enough. We thank you kindly." A pause. "You stone? From the auction back in October?" Ezra must have nodded because the man continued. "Thought so. Passed through Redemption Creek yesterday. Marshal Dawson mentioned you. Asked if we were coming this way to check if you needed anything after the blizzard." Charlotte felt a ripple of relief. Sheriff Dawson had been looking out for them, in his way. "We'll be moving on," the older man said. "Sorry for the trouble." The sound of boots crunching in snow followed, then horses being mounted. Soon the noise faded into the distance, leaving only the wind's whisper around the cabin corners. Ezra secured the door, then made his way to Charlotte, his breath coming in harsh bursts from the exertion. She reached for him, finding his face with her hand. "Are you all right?" she asked. "Your heart is racing." He caught her wrists gently, then traced, "BROVE." Charlotte felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I'm sorry for that. It seemed safer somehow. They thought we were married." His finger traced again. Ace MRT. They remained close, the adrenaline of the confrontation still coursing through them. Charlotte became acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his skin beneath her fingers, the steady rhythm of his breath. She hadn't been this physically close to another person in years, not since before her illness. "Ezra," she began, uncertainty coloring her voice. He moved then, closing what little distance remained between them. His lips found hers in a kiss so gentle it might have been a whisper. Charlotte froze momentarily, surprised not by the act itself, but by how right it felt, like the resolution of a musical phrase long left hanging. She responded, her hand sliding from his face to his shoulders, steadying him as much as herself. The kiss deepened, a conversation without words or touch language, pure and direct in its meaning. When they finally broke apart, Charlotte kept her hands on his shoulders, unwilling to lose the connection. Her heart thundered in her chest, and she could feel the rapid rise and fall of his as well. "I didn't expect that," she said softly, a small smile lifting the corners of her mouth. "But I'm not sorry it happened." Ezra's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. Then he traced against her skin, an EITHRAMI. That evening, as snow began to fall again outside, Charlotte played her violin. Not the classical pieces she usually chose, but simpler melodies. Folk songs her father had loved, lullabies her mother had sung. Ezra sat close beside her on the sofa, his leg propped on a stool, occasionally tapping rhythms against her knee in accompaniment. When she finished playing, she set the violin aside and leaned against him, his arm coming around her shoulders as naturally as if they'd sat this way for years. "I used to pray for healing," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "For my sight to return. I thought without it I would never be whole again." Ezra's hand found hers, waiting for her to continue. "I don't pray for that anymore," she said. "Being blind is difficult, yes. There are days I rage against it still, but I'm beginning to think perhaps we're not meant to be whole individually. Perhaps we find our missing pieces in others." His fingers traced slowly on her palm. "YOUCOMPETE, me." Charlotte laughed softly. "That sounds like something from one of my mother's romance novels. but she turned her face up toward his. It's true, isn't it? You hear from me. I speak for you, and somehow together we're more than either of us alone. In response, Ezra kissed her again, a silent affirmation of a truth they were both discovering. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in quiet beauty neither of them could see, but both could feel a sense of stillness, of rightness, of coming home after a long journey. January yielded to February. February began its slow surrender to March. The brutal cold gradually softened, and the snow, once piled waist-high around the cabin, compacted and receded. Ezra's ankle healed enough that he no longer needed the crutch, though he still favored his good leg when walking. Their days fell into a rhythm as natural and necessary as heartbeats. They rose with the sun, worked side by side through the day, and spent evenings by the fire, Charlotte playing her violin while Ezra listened, his eyes closed in appreciation. At night, they slept in their separate rooms, though their goodnight embraces lingered longer each evening. On a particularly mild afternoon in early March, Ezra led Charlotte outside, guiding her hand to feel the first signs of thaussicles dripping from the eaves, patches of bare earth emerging from beneath the snow. Spring is coming, she said, her face turned up to catch the strengthening sun. I can smell it in the air, that particular dampness, like the earth is waking up. Ezra squeezed her hand once, then traced. You want to go riding? She clarified. Is your ankle strong enough? Tapped once for yes, then added TOGETHR. Charlotte smiled. I'd like that. We've been cooped up for so long. They saddled Echo, Ezra insisting that Charlotte mount first, then he settled behind her. With his arms around her waist and the reins in his hands, they set off at a gentle pace. Shadow bounded alongside them, barking joyfully at the adventure. Ezra guided the horse along the creek, following its winding path through the property, though Charlotte couldn't see the landscape. She experienced it through her other senses, the babble of water breaking free from ice, the occasional snap of a branch as snow fell from its burden, the varied textures of sunlight as it filtered through bare trees or warmed her face in open clearings. They stopped at a promontory overlooking the valley. Ezra helped Charlotte dismount, then led her to a sun-warmed boulder where they could sit. The air was crisp, but not biting, carrying the promise of renewal. Describe it to me, Charlotte requested, her gloved hand finding his. What do you see? Ezra considered for a moment, then began tracing on her palm. The process was slow, but had become more efficient as they developed shorthand for common words. He painted the landscape for her, the valley stretching below them, patches of white snow alternating with exposed brown earth like a quilt, the creek winding its silver path through the center, distant mountains still capped with white, a hawk circling above, riding thermal currents. Charlotte listened with her entire body, her face animated as she pieced together the mental image. It sounds beautiful, she said when he finished, like the world is half asleep, stretching before fully waking. Ezra guided her hand to his face, letting her feel his smile. Then he traced WNT Somita SONG. What is it? Instead of answering, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the wooden carving he'd been working on throughout winter. He placed it in her hands, a small, intricately carved bird, its wings outstretched as if in flight. Every feather was detailed, the wood smooth and warm from his pocket. Oh, Ezra, Charlotte breathed, her fingers exploring the carving. It's exquisite. A songbird? He tapped once for yes, then traced. Like you, like me. She turned the bird over in her hands. Because of my music? Fari Eon, SONG. Tears welled in Charlotte's unseeing eyes. That's perhaps the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me. She carefully tucked the carving into her own pocket, then reached for his face, guiding him toward her for a kiss. When they parted, Ezra traced on her palm, Emma, ROI, me. Charlotte went still, her breath catching. Marry you? Truly, one firm tap. But my contract, I still have more than a year of service. BUYOUT. You do that? Purchase my contract outright? Another tap, more insistent this time. Charlotte's face broke into a radiant smile. Yes, I'll marry you. They rode home in a bubble of shared joy, the promise of a future together warming them more effectively than the strengthening sun. Back at the cabin, Charlotte immediately took up her violin, playing a jubilant reel that had Ezra tapping his foot despite his still tender ankle. As evening approached, they began planning a trip to town. Ezra would need to visit the bank to withdraw money for Charlotte's contract, then see Mayor Hollister to arrange the official transfer. They decided to go the following week when the trails would likely be clearer. We should invite Sheriff Dawson to the wedding, Charlotte suggested as they prepared supper. He's been kind to us in his way, and perhaps Mrs. Winters. Ezra agreed with a tap, then traced SMALL. Yes, small is better. Neither of us are much for crowds. She paused in her work, a thought striking her. Ezra, what about your family? Is there anyone you'd want to invite? It was quiet for so long that Charlotte began to wonder if he'd heard her. Finally, his fingers found her hand. CISERDEEDPREEASEASEAS. Oh, CONTACT. I'm sorry, she said softly. About your sister and your parents? They're alive, but you don't speak? ONOT. CNCE. RROW. Charlotte nodded in understanding. They couldn't accept what happened. The loss of your voice. One tap, confirmation tinged with old pain. Then we'll make our own family, she said firmly. You, me, and Shadow. She smiled. And perhaps someday children. Ezra's hand found hers again, squeezing it with such emotion that words straced or spoken weren't necessary. The following Tuesday they set out for town. The trail had indeed improved, much of the snow now melted, leaving muddy but passable paths. Charlotte wore one of the dresses Miss Winters had helped her select months ago, a deep green wool that complemented her chestnut hair, which she'd arranged in a neat bun at the nape of her neck. Ezra rode beside her on the mare, having decided Charlotte was skilled enough now to handle her own mount. Shadow ran ahead, occasionally circling back as if to ensure they were following. "Are you nervous?" Charlotte asked as they neared Redemption Creek. "About seeing people again?" Ezra reached across the space between their horses and tapped her arm twice for no. Then he added, "Proud? Proud? What, U.S.?" The simple statement warmed her from within. She was proud, too, of how they'd faced winter's challenges together, of the life they were building, of the future that now stretched before them. As they rode into town, Charlotte sensed the same curious stares they'd attracted on their previous visit, but they felt less intrusive now. Let people look. Let them wonder. She and Ezra knew what they had found together, and that was all that mattered. They stopped first at the bank, where Ezra withdrew the funds needed to buy out Charlotte's contract. Then they made their way to the mayor's office. Mayor Hollister seemed surprised by their request, but processed the paperwork efficiently enough. "Well, Miss Harlow," he said as he finalized the documents, "it appears your contract of indenture is now fulfilled. You're a free woman, able to stay in these parts or move on as you choose." "Thank you," Charlotte replied, "but I've already made my choice." She reached for Ezra's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. The mayor cleared his throat. "I see. Well, if you're seeking a marriage license, that would be Judge Parker's domain. He holds court on Thursdays." As they left the mayor's office, a familiar voice called out to them from across the street. "Stone, Miss Harlow." Sheriff Dawson strode toward them, his badge catching the midday sun. "Good to see you both recovered from that blizzard. Had me worried when those travelers mentioned you." Charlotte smiled in the direction of his voice. "Sheriff Dawson, we're grateful for your concern. Those men you sent checking on us arrived at a rather opportune moment. Did they now? Well, good to hear." The sheriff's tone turned curious. "What brings you to town today? Supplies running low?" "Actually," Charlotte replied, unable to keep the happiness from her voice, "we've just completed the buyout of my contract, and we're planning to see Judge Parker on Thursday about a marriage license." A moment of stunned silence followed, then a hearty laugh. "Well, can't say I'm surprised, mind you. You two seemed well matched from the start. Odd as that might sound. Congratulations to you both." As they continued through town, completing their errands, Charlotte noticed a change in how people reacted to them. Word of their engagement had apparently spread quickly. The whispers seemed less derisive, the glances more curious than judgmental. At the general store, Mrs. Winters was effusively happy for them, insisting on showing Charlotte fabrics that might be suitable for a wedding dress. "Nothing fancy," Charlotte demurred. "Something simple but nice." "I have just the thing," Mrs. Winters assured her. "A lovely cream wool with a bit of lace trim. We can have it ready by Thursday if you're serious about seeing the judge so soon." By late afternoon, as they prepared to return to the ranch, Charlotte felt a strange sense of acceptance from the town that had once seemed so unwelcoming. Not universal acceptance, certainly. They had passed Frank Miller outside the saloon, and his muttered comments were as crude as ever, but enough to make her feel that perhaps they could build a life here that extended beyond the boundaries of Ezra's ranch. As they rode home, the spring sun warming their backs, Charlotte reached across to touch Ezra's arm. "I feel like we've crossed some kind of threshold today," she said. "Not just with the contract or the wedding plans, but something deeper. Like we're no longer defined by what we lack, but by what we've built together." Ezra guided his horse closer to hers, leaning over to trace on her hand. "Unever. Lacked. Love. "No," Charlotte agreed softly, her throat tight with emotion, "that we've always had in abundance." They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence, each lost in thoughts of the future unfolding before them, a future neither could have imagined 6 months earlier, when a silent cowboy cut down a blind woman from a tree, and two broken paths unexpectedly converged. Thursday dawned clear and mild, with birdsong filtering through the cabin windows for the first time since autumn. Charlotte woke early, her heart fluttering with anticipation. Wedding day. The words seemed strange, unexpected, a future she had once resigned herself to never having. She dressed carefully in the new cream wool dress Mrs. Winters had finished just yesterday. The fabric was soft against her skin, the simple lace at the collar and cuffs adding a touch of refinement without ostentation. She arranged her hair in a more elaborate style than usual, pinning it up with the tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's, one of the few possessions she'd brought from Boston. In the main room, she heard Ezra moving about, the floorboards creaking beneath his boots. His steps were more even now, the limp barely perceptible after months of healing. "Good morning," she called, emerging from her room. "How are you feeling today?" His hand found hers immediately, tracing HMPPY. Charlotte smiled. "As am I." After a light breakfast, they prepared for the journey to town. Ezra had spent the previous evening grooming the horses until their coats gleamed, and he'd polished his boots to a shine Charlotte could feel when she ran her fingertips over the leather. "Your best shirt feels freshly pressed," she observed as she straightened his collar. You've been busy. He caught her hand and pressed it to his chest where his heart beat steady and strong. No words were necessary to convey his meaning. The ride to Redemption Creek was pleasant, the trail now mostly dry with spring's advance. Charlotte wore a shawl against the morning chill, but by midday the sun had warmed the air enough that she could remove it, tilting her face up to catch the rays on her skin. I've been thinking, she said as they neared town, about what happens after today. I know it may seem silly since we've been living together for months, but everything will be different, won't it? Ezra guided his horse alongside hers and reached across to touch her arm, tapping twice for no. No? She asked, surprised. You don't think it will change things? His fingers traced, Lareada. Why? Efmioy. Charlotte's throat tightened with emotion. Yes. I suppose we are. Have been for some time. She smiled. The ceremony just makes it official. They arrived in town to find more activity than usual for a Thursday. Wagons lined the main street and voices filled the air as people moved between the general store and the saloon. What's happening? Charlotte asked, sensing the unusual bustle. Ezra guided their horses toward the sheriff's office where Dawson stood on the porch. The lawman raised a hand in greeting. Right on time, he called. Judge Parker's been waiting for you. As they dismounted, Charlotte cocked her head, still puzzled by the activity around them. Is there an event in town today? The sheriff chuckled. You might say that. Word got around about your wedding. Seems folks were curious to see it for themselves. Dots. Single quotes. Charlotte felt a flash of anxiety. A crowd? I hadn't expected. Nothing to worry about, Dawson assured her. Most are just going about their business. But I won't. There's interest in seeing the union of Redemption Creek's most talked about couple. Ezra's hand found Charlotte's, giving it a reassuring squeeze. She took a deep breath and nodded. All right, we're ready. Judge Parker had set up in the town hall a modest building that doubled as a church on Sundays. As Charlotte and Ezra entered, guided by the sheriff, she sensed several people already inside, the rustle of clothing, the scent of different perfumes and colognes, the shifting of feet on wooden floors. Quite the turnout, Dawson murmured. Mrs. Winters and her husband, the blacksmith and his family, even old Doc Simmons, and a few others. Charlotte squeezed Ezra's hand, suddenly grateful for the witnesses. Their union would not be a secret or something shameful, but a public declaration acknowledged by the community. Judge Parker's voice boomed from the front of the room. Shall we begin? Mr. Stone, Miss Harlow, please step forward. The ceremony was brief and straightforward. Judge Parker spoke of commitment and partnership, of facing life's challenges together. When he asked if they would take each other in marriage, Charlotte answered with a clear "I will," while Ezra tapped the judge's Bible once firmly. I understand Mr. Stone has a ring, the judge announced. Charlotte felt Ezra reach for her hand. He slid something cool and smooth onto her finger, a band that felt like polished wood rather than metal. What is it? She whispered. Mrs. Winters, standing nearby, leaned in. It's a wooden ring, dear. Carved from cherry wood by the look of it. Quite beautiful, with little musical notes etched all around it. Tears sprang to Charlotte's eyes as she understood. Ezra had made this himself, incorporating the music that had first brought them together. She reached for his hand and found that he wore a matching band. By the authority vested in me by the territory of Montana, Judge Parker concluded. I now pronounce you husband and wife. A smattering of applause broke out as Ezra drew Charlotte into a gentle kiss. When they turned to face the gathering, she was startled to hear someone call out, "How about a tune, Miss Ms. Stone?" "A violin," she began. "I didn't bring, actually," Sheriff Dawson interrupted. "Your husband asked me to fetch it from your saddlebag earlier. Thought you might want it." The familiar case was pressed into her hands. Touched by Ezra's foresight, Charlotte removed the instrument and positioned it under her chin. Without hesitation, she began to play not a classical piece or a somber hymn, but a joyful folk melody that invited movement and celebration. To her surprise, someone began to clap in rhythm, then another joined in. The floor vibrated slightly as people started to dance. Beside her, Ezra tapped his foot in time with the music, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Impromptu celebrations spilled out onto the street, with Charlotte continuing to play as they moved outside into the spring sunshine. More townspeople joined them, curious about the music and commotion. Charlotte played tune after tune, her fingers flying over the strings, her body swaying with the rhythm. For nearly an hour, the main street of Redemption Creek became a dance floor, with even the most skeptical residents tapping their feet or clapping along. When Charlotte finally lowered her violin, breathless and flushed with exertion and happiness, applause erupted around them. "Never heard playing like that," someone commented nearby, a woman's voice Charlotte didn't recognize. "Got a real gift," another agreed. "Makes you forget she can't see." "And did you notice how they communicate?" The first voice continued. "No words, just touches, like they got their own language." Charlotte felt a surge of validation. For the first time, people were seeing beyond their disabilities to the connection she and Ezra had forged, the unique system they'd developed, the strengths they'd discovered in each other. Mars. Winters approached, pressing a package into Charlotte's hands. "A small gift from the store," she explained. "Just some preserves and coffee and such, to celebrate your new beginning." Others followed suit, the blacksmith offering to shoe their horses free of charge next time they needed it, Doc Simmons presenting a bottle of good whiskey for medicinal purposes, and several women contributing homemade treats or small household items. By late afternoon, as Charlotte and Ezra prepared to return to the ranch, she felt a shift in the town's perception of them. They weren't just curiosities anymore. The mute rancher and his blind wife, but members of the community, unique but accepted. Sheriff Dawson walked them to their horses. That was something to see, he commented. Think you've won over some of the doubters today. Music has a way of reaching people, Charlotte replied, carefully stowing her violin in its case. Of bridging differences, that it does. The sheriff cleared his throat. Listen, I've been meaning to tell you both. Frank Miller and his friends won't be bothering you anymore. Had a little chat with them after hearing about their comments last time you were in town. Made it clear that disrespecting MR's Stone, you now wouldn't be tolerated. Charlotte felt Ezra extend his hand to the sheriff, a gesture of genuine gratitude. You're good people, Dawson concluded gruffly. This town's better for having you in it. The ride home was peaceful, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the trail. Charlotte rode close beside Ezra, occasionally reaching across to touch his arm, reassuring herself of his presence. I never imagined such a day, she said as they approached the ranch. Not just being married, though that still seems miraculous enough, but being accepted, having people see us for who we are rather than what we're missing. Ezra guided his horse closer and traced on her arm. Oh me, BTTER. Yes, she agreed. As wonderful as today was, I'm looking forward to being our home. At the cabin, Ezra helped Charlotte dismount, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms and carrying her across the threshold. She laughed in delight, her arms around his neck. Your ankle. Are you sure it's strong enough? He set her gently on her feet inside and traced RNG, EANO, UGH, FO, YOU. That night, the relationship transformed in its final aspect. Two bodies learning each other as their minds and hearts already had. Charlotte discovered that blindness heightened her other senses. The feel of Ezra's skin beneath her fingertips, the scent of his skin, the sound of his quickened breath, and Ezra found that his silence made his touch more eloquent. Each caress a verse in a poem his voice could never have spoken. Afterward, as they lay entwined before the fireplace, Charlotte nestled against Ezra's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. I used to think being blind was the worst thing that could happen to me, she murmured. Now I wonder if it wasn't leading me here all along. To you, to this life we're creating. Ezra's fingers traced slowly along her bare shoulder. DESTINY. Perhaps, she agreed, smiling against his skin. Or perhaps just the kind of beautiful accident that happens when two unlikely people find each other in an unlikely place. His arms tightened around her, and in that embrace was all the response she needed. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Witnesses to the new harmony created within those cabin walls, a melody composed of touch and silence, of presence and understanding, of two broken pieces forming something stronger at their joining. Seasons chained, one flowing into the next like movements in a symphony. Spring brought wildflowers and gentle rains. Summer arrived with long golden days and nights filled with cricket song. Autumn painted the landscape in rich hues before winter returned, wrapping the ranch in its crystalline embrace once more. Through it all, Charlotte and Ezra moved in perfect rhythm, their days marked by shared work and quiet contentment, their communication growing more nuanced and intuitive with each passing month. The ranch prospered under their joint Ezra's strength and knowledge paired with Charlotte's meticulous organization and surprising creativity. Word spread about the unusual couple at Stone Ranch. Charlotte's reputation as a violinist grew beyond Redemption Creek, bringing occasional visitors who had heard of the blind woman who played with such skill that listeners forgot her disability. She began giving lessons to children from town who would arrive weekly, brought by parents who no longer saw her blindness as a limitation but as a different way of experiencing music. Ezra expanded his cattle operation with Charlotte's encouragement, hiring Miguel's nephew as a ranch hand to help with the increased workload. The young man Leas quickly learned to understand Ezra's tap language and respected the efficient partnership between his employers. One crisp October morning, a year and a half after their wedding, Charlotte stood on the porch, her hand resting on her swollen belly, feeling the baby's movements beneath her fingers. At 7 months pregnant, she had developed a new awareness of her body, a different kind of mapping than the one she'd created after losing her sight. Are you restless today, little one? She murmured, smiling as she felt a definitive kick in response. Just like your father, always moving, always working. The sound of approaching hoofbeats caught her attention. Not Ezra's horse, she knew his rhythm too well. Multiple riders moving at a steady pace up the trail toward the cabin. Charlotte tilted her head, listening intently, but sensed no threat in their approach. Shadow, now graying around his muzzle but still alert, gave a single bark of acknowledgement rather than warning. The riders came to a stop in the yard. A woman's voice called out cheerfully, "Hello, Mrs. Stone. Is this a good time for visitors?" Mrs. Winters, Charlotte replied, recognizing the storekeeper's wife. Of course, please come up. 3 sets of footsteps ascended the porch steps. Mrs. Winters and 2 others whose tread Charlotte didn't recognize. I've brought someone who was asking after you in town, Mrs. Winters explained. This is James Hartford from Denver. He's with the Western Symphony Association. Mrs. Stone, a deep voice greeted her. A pleasure to meet you. Sheriff Dawson suggested I should make your acquaintance when I mentioned I was seeking musical talent for our winter concert series. Charlotte inclined her head. You're interested in music, Mr. Hartford? I'm a conductor, Mrs. Stone. Our association brings orchestral music to cities and towns throughout the Western Territories. But we're always seeking new soloists to feature in our performances. And you've come all this way to speak with me? Charlotte asked, surprised. I'm flattered, but We heard you play at the Redemption Creek Founders Day celebration last month. The third visitor interjected, a younger man with a crisp accent that suggested Eastern education. I'm Edward Kensington, Mr. Hartford's assistant. Your rendition of Paganini was ... extraordinary, especially considering my blindness. Charlotte finished with a small smile. I apologized, Edward said quickly. That was poorly phrased. No offense taken, Mr. Kensington. It is an undeniable fact of my life. She gestured toward the door. Please, come inside. My husband should return from the north pasture shortly. As Charlotte prepared coffee for her guests, Mr. Hartford explained the purpose of their visit. The Western Symphony Association was organizing a tour for the coming winter 10 cities over 3 months, featuring orchestral performances and selected soloists. We would be honored if you would consider joining us as a featured violinist, he concluded. The compensation is generous and all travel and accommodation provided. Charlotte set the coffee cups on the table with practiced precision. It's a remarkable offer, Mr. Hartford, but my circumstances make such a commitment difficult. As you can see, I'm expecting our first child in December. The tour doesn't begin until February, Edward noted, and arrangements could be made for your comfort and privacy. It's not just the baby, Charlotte replied, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. My husband ... We are uniquely suited to each other. A separation of 3 months would be challenging for both of us. Perhaps he could accompany you, Mrs. Winters suggested. It would be such an opportunity, Charlotte. Your talent deserves a wider audience. Before Charlotte could respond, the door opened and Ezra's familiar steps sounded on the floorboards. Shadow trotted to greet him, followed by Charlotte, who briefly explained the presence of their visitors. Mr. Hartford rose to shake Ezra's hand. Mr. Stone, we were just discussing the possibility of your wife joining our symphony tour as a featured soloist. Her reputation as a violinist has spread beyond your town. Charlotte sensed Ezra's surprise in the stillness that followed, the slight tension in his arm beneath her hand. Then he tapped her wrist once, encouraging her to speak her mind. It's a generous offer, she said carefully, but I've built my life here with Ezra and soon our child. I'm not certain I could leave, even temporarily. Mr. Hartford sighed. I understand family commitments, Mrs. Stone, but may I make a counter-proposal? Instead of the full tour, perhaps you would consider performing at just our Denver concert? It would be 1 week in February, not 3 months. Charlotte felt Ezra's fingers trace on her arm. Y-O-U-S-H-O-U-L-D-G-O. She turned toward him, surprised. You think so? Another tap, more decisive this time. Your husband seems supportive, Edward observed. He is, Charlotte agreed, a lump forming in her throat at Ezra's generosity. He's always encouraged my music. The discussion continued over coffee, with arrangements made for Charlotte to perform in Denver the following February. Mr. Hartford was clearly disappointed not to secure her for the full tour, but pleased to have her for their premiere concert. As the visitors prepared to leave, he paused. One last question, Mrs. Stone. The program notes will mention your remarkable story overcoming blindness to become such an accomplished musician. Is there anything specific you'd like us to include? Charlotte considered this, her hand finding Ezra's. Please mention that I perform not despite my blindness, but with it. It's shaped how I hear music, how I interpret it. She squeezed Ezra's fingers. And perhaps note that I'm accompanied by my husband, Ezra Stone, without whose support my music would not be possible. After the visitors departed, Charlotte and Ezra sat on the porch swing, installed the previous summer so she could enjoy the outdoors more comfortably as her pregnancy progressed. Are you certain about this? She asked. About me going to Denver? Ezra traced on her palm, Y-O-U-R-S-H-R-E. My gift should be shared, she translated. But what about you and the baby? Can't bear the thought of leaving you both, even for a week. C-O-Me. T-O-O. Charlotte laughed in relief. All 3 of us? A family adventure to the city? He tapped once, then continued, Proudofyou. Tears welled in Charlotte's eyes. Proud of us, Ezra, of what we've built together. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come across me that day, hanging from that tree. His answer was immediate. Fate, she repeated softly. Perhaps you're right. December brought their daughter into the world, Elizabeth Grace Stone, born during a gentle snowfall that blanketed the ranch in pristine white. She had her father's eyes and her mother's determined chin, and from her first moments she seemed unusually attuned to sound, turning toward voices and particularly toward Charlotte's violin when she played. By February, when they made the journey to Denver for Charlotte's performance, Elizabeth was a robust 2-month-old with a disposition as sunny as her father's was reserved. The city intimidated Charlotte initially, its noise and bustle so different from the ranch's peaceful rhythm, but with Ezra beside her, one hand always guiding or supporting, she navigated its challenges. The night of the concert arrived and Charlotte prepared in their hotel room, donning the new gown Merce. Winters had helped her select deep blue velvet that complemented her chestnut hair, now pinned up with pearl combs, a gift from Ezra on Elizabeth's birth. Are you nervous? She asked Ezra as he fastened the last button at her back. His finger tapped twice against her shoulder. No, of course not. His faith in her had never wavered. At the concert hall, Charlotte stood backstage, violin in hand, listening to the orchestra begin the evening's program. Ezra waited with Elizabeth in a private box, the baby contentedly sleeping against his chest, unaware of the significance of the night. When Charlotte was announced and led onto the stage, the applause was polite, curious. She bowed in the direction of the audience, positioned her violin, and took a deep breath. Then she began to play. She had chosen Mendelssohn's Violin Concerto in E minor, a piece that expressed both melancholy and joy, struggle and triumph. Her fingers flew across the strings with practiced precision, but it was the emotion she poured into each note that gradually silenced the rustling audience, drawing them into her world of sound and feeling. Charlotte played with her eyes closed, as was her habit, but midway through the piece she opened them, gazing sightlessly toward the box where she knew Ezra and Elizabeth waited. Though she couldn't see them, she felt their presence as surely as she felt the violin beneath her chin. When the final note faded, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the hall erupted in thunderous applause, the audience rising to their feet in recognition of something extraordinary. Charlotte bowed, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the response. Backstage, after 3 curtain calls, Ezra found her, Elizabeth, sleeping peacefully in the crook of his arm. He passed the baby to a waiting Mrs. Winters, then took Charlotte's face in his hands. She felt wetness on his cheek stares from her stoic, silent cowboy. "It moved you that much?" she whispered. He traced on her palm slowly and deliberately. "SEWCOOOR. Charlotte's breath caught. "You saw colors? In the music?" One firm tap. "Yes." "What were they like?" "BLUE. Go LD. RED. His fingers paused, then continued. LIKESUISETOVER RNCH. Charlotte laughed through her tears. "A sunset I can't see, described through music you can't voice, yet somehow we both understand perfect." She leaned her forehead against his. "That's us, isn't it? Finding ways to share what should be impossible to communicate." On their return to the ranch a week later, life resumed its familiar pattern, though subtly changed by their experiences in Denver. Charlotte had declined further concert offers, but agreed to record several pieces for the Edison Company, allowing her music to travel where she chose not to. Elizabeth grew and thrived, babbling happily in a household where communication took many forms beyond words. One evening in early summer, as twilight softened the edges of the day, Ezra sat on the porch with Elizabeth on his knee, watching as Charlotte played her violin at the edge of the yard. Shadow lay at her feet, his muzzle now completely gray but his eyes still alert and devoted. The melody floated on the evening air, something Charlotte had composed herself, inspired by their life together. It spoke of struggle and resilience, of finding unexpected joy, of building something beautiful from broken pieces. Elizabeth clapped her tiny hands in delight at the music, and Ezra bounced her gently on his knee in time with the rhythm. As the final notes faded into the gathering dusk, Charlotte lowered her violin and turned toward the porch, a smile illuminating her face. "Did she like it?" called. Ezra guided Elizabeth's hand to tap once against the porch railing, their daughter already learning the unique language of their family. Charlotte laughed and made her way back to the porch, each step confident on the path she had memorized. She settled beside them on the swing, tucking herself against Ezra's side as he wrapped an arm around her shoulder. "I was thinking," she said softly, "about that auction day when you bid. Did you ever imagine we'd end up here?" Ezra shifted Elizabeth to his other knee and traced on Charlotte's palm. "HOPE. You hope," she repeated, leaning up to kiss him softly. "So did I, though I didn't know it then." As darkness fell completely, they remained on the porch, a family forged from unlikely circumstances. Their disabilities, not walls that separated them from the world, but bridges that had connected them to each other. The night was filled with stars they experienced differently, Ezra through sight, Charlotte through the cooling air on her skin and the deepening quiet of nocturnal sounds. Different perceptions, different languages, but one shared truth. Finding each other, they had both finally come home.